The rain never stopped in the A6M Valley. It fell in sheets, turning the earth into a soup of red mud that clung to everything, weighed down every step, swallowed entire men whole if they stood still too long. Eddie Miller crouched in his foxhole, water pooling around his boots, and scratched another entry into his waterlogged notebook. The words came harder now than they had 6 months ago. Back then, he'd filled pages with observations about the jungle, philosophical musings about duty and honor, careful descriptions of the landscape, as if he were writing the great American war novel. Now his entries read like grocery lists. Rain, leeches, smell of burnt meat. Johnson's gone. 3 words where there used to be 3 paragraphs. The diminishing returns of language in the face of repetitive horror. He'd heard the older guys talk about Ia Drang, that valley up in the Central Highlands where the 1st Cavalry had fought the North Vietnamese army to a bloody draw back in 1965. They spoke of it with a kind of reverence, as if it had taught the army something profound about fighting in this green hell. But sitting here in another valley, watching another generation of American boys get chewed up by the same enemy, using the same tactics in the same kind of terrain, Eddie couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of déjà vu. It was as if the entire war was a phonograph stuck on repeat, the needle scratching over the same groove again and again, playing the same deadly song. The only thing that changed were the names on the casualty lists. The Tet Offensive of 1968 had shattered something fundamental in the American psyche. When the networks showed footage of Viet Cong sappers inside the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon, when Walter Cronkite returned from Vietnam and told Middle America that the war was unwinnable, when the images of executions and napalm strikes flooded living rooms across the country, the comfortable narrative of imminent victory collapsed. The military claimed Tet was a tactical victory, and perhaps it was. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces had suffered catastrophic casualties, but wars are not won by body counts alone, and the political landscape had shifted irreversibly. In Washington, Lyndon Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. Richard Nixon rode into the White House on promises of peace with honor, but what that meant in practice was a strategy of escalation disguised as withdrawal, more bombing, secret incursions into Cambodia and Laos. Vietnamization, they called it, a term that sounded progressive but simply meant transferring the dying from American boys to South Vietnamese boys, while American planes continued to rain death from above. In Hanoi, the Politburo under Le Duan calculated with cold precision. They had taken staggering losses during Tet, entire cadres wiped out. But they had demonstrated something crucial. They could strike anywhere, anytime, and most importantly, they were willing to absorb casualties that would have broken any Western army. The calculation was brutally simple. America was a democracy with a free press and an increasingly vocal anti-war movement. Every American death was a political liability, a telegram to a grieving family, a protest on a college campus. North Vietnam operated under no such constraints. They could lose 10 men for every American killed and still consider it a favorable exchange rate because time was on their side. The longer the war dragged on, the more American resolve would crack. It was not a question of if America would leave, but when. Eddie Miller had grown up in a small Pennsylvania town where everyone knew everyone, and the Vietnam War was an abstraction, something that happened in grainy black and white on the television between dinner and dessert. His father had stormed Normandy, came back with medals and stories about the clear moral certainty of fighting fascism. His mother read Shakespeare aloud in the evenings, her voice giving life to Henry V's St. Crispin's Day speech. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Eddie had absorbed it all, the mythology of just war and noble sacrifice. And when his draft notice came, he didn't run to Canada like some of his classmates. He volunteered for the 101st Airborne, for the hardest duty, because he believed that his generation had a chance to get it right, to learn from the mistakes of Ia Drang and all the other valleys where American blood had been spilled. He wanted to be tested in the crucible, to prove something to his father, to his country, to himself. But the A6M Valley didn't care about his idealism. It was a strategic nightmare, a 30-kilometer-long corridor running parallel to the Laotian border, shrouded in perpetual mist and rain, its steep slopes covered in triple canopy jungle so thick that air support was nearly useless. The North Vietnamese army used it as a major infiltration route, a funnel for men and supplies flowing down from the Ho Chi Minh Trail into the populated areas of South Vietnam. Multiple times the Americans had tried to establish fire bases in the valley, and multiple times they'd been overrun or forced to withdraw. It was a place that swallowed battalions whole and gave nothing back but body bags. On the other side of the mountains, in a bunker complex dug deep into the hillside, a young political officer named Hoan composed his weekly report by candlelight. He was 25 years old, university educated, chosen for his ideological purity and his gift for oratory. Before the war, he had imagined himself as a teacher, shaping young minds in the new Vietnam that would emerge after victory. Instead, he found himself in the Aw Shao, giving political education lectures to gaunt soldiers who'd been living underground for months, eating rice mixed with leaves, watching their comrades die from malaria as often as from bullets. The lectures followed a script. American imperialism would inevitably fail. The People's War was righteous and certain of victory. Every sacrifice brought liberation closer. He delivered these speeches with conviction, or at least with the appearance of conviction, but late at night, writing by flickering candlelight, his private thoughts were more complicated. Hoan kept a separate notebook, one that would never be seen by his superiors, where he recorded the names of men who had died under his command. Not the official statistics, those meaningless numbers that reduced human beings to data points, but actual names, the villages they came from, small details he'd learned about their lives. There was Duke, who'd planned to be a school teacher, Thang, who made everyone laugh with his terrible jokes, Vin, who cried at night for his wife and newborn daughter he'd never met. The notebook was growing thick with names, and sometimes Hoan wondered what victory would taste like when it came mixed with this much blood and sorrow. But he couldn't voice these doubts. To question the price of victory was to commit treason against the revolution, and in the political structure of the North Vietnamese army, doubt was a virus that had to be contained before it spread. The fear that drove both Eddie and Hoan was not primarily the fear of death, though that was ever present. It was the fear of being thought a coward. Both had been raised in cultures that equated masculinity with martial courage, that taught boys that the worst possible fate was to be seen as weak, as a shirker, as someone who let his comrades down. For Eddie, it was the legacy of his father's generation, the men who had defeated Hitler and saved the world. How could he do any less? For Hoan, it was the revolutionary ethic that demanded total dedication to the collective, that celebrated martyrdom as the highest form of service to the people. Both were trapped in narratives larger than themselves, narratives that demanded they feed their bodies into the machine and call it glory. Captain Tran of the South Vietnamese Marines had a different kind of fear. He was 33 years old, a professional soldier who'd fought along the DMZ, who'd been at Khe Sanh when the North Vietnamese artillery turned the combat base into hell on earth. He'd learned to depend on American firepower, American medevacs, American logistics. His Marines were good fighters, tough men who knew the terrain and spoke the language in ways the Americans never could. But they depended on the technological and material superiority that the U.S. provided. Now, as Vietnamization accelerated, he watched American units rotating home while the fighting continued at the same intensity. The firebase he commanded still got artillery support, still got airstrikes when the weather allowed. But there were fewer Americans behind those guns and in those cockpits. The message was clear. South Vietnam would have to stand on its own. Captain Tran didn't doubt his men's courage, but he understood logistics, and he knew that courage without bullets, without medical supplies, without food, was just another word for dying slowly. In a village along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a 17-year-old girl named Lan shouldered her load of rice and began the night's march. She was part of the Youth Volunteer Brigade, teenagers pressed into service to keep the trail functioning despite American bombing. Her job was simple: carry supplies south, repair roads and bridges destroyed by airstrikes, guide columns of soldiers through the mountain passes. The work was backbreaking and terrifying. B-52 strikes came without warning, turning sections of trail into moonscapes. Unexploded ordnance littered the path, and every week someone in her unit was killed or maimed by a bomb they'd accidentally triggered. But Lan had volunteered, or at least she told herself she'd volunteered. Her family was poor, her village had been bombed, and the recruiters had painted a picture of patriotic service and guaranteed rice rations. She was good at her job, good at hiding her fear behind jokes and determination, but her body was falling apart. Malaria came in waves. The weight of the loads gave her back problems that would never fully heal. She was 17 years old and felt 40. The terrain of the A6M and the surrounding Annamite mountains was itself a weapon. Slopes so steep that men had to pull themselves up using vines, their legs shaking with exhaustion after climbing 100 meters. Streams that looked ankle-deep but concealed pits that could drown a man with a heavy pack. The jungle canopy was so thick that even at noon it was twilight at ground level. Visibility extended maybe 10 meters before the vegetation swallowed everything. This was not terrain where American advantages in firepower and mobility meant much. Helicopters struggled to find landing zones, and when they did, they became sitting ducks for machine gun fire. Jets could drop tons of ordnance, but how do you bomb an enemy you can't see, who lives underground, who moves through tunnels and emerges only to fire a burst and disappear? The North Vietnamese had learned from Ia Drang that fighting American units in open terrain was suicide, so they adapted. They embraced a strategy called hugging the belt, staying so close to American positions that artillery and air support risked killing friendly forces. They turned the war into a knife fight in a dark room, where technology mattered less than will and endurance. In May of 1969, Eddie Miller's unit, along with other elements of the 101st Airborne, received orders to assault Hill 937, known as Ap Bia Mountain, near the Laotian border. Intelligence indicated that a North Vietnamese regiment had fortified the hill, and command wanted it taken. The briefing officers spoke confidently about a quick operation, maybe a few days of fighting, and then they'd control another piece of terrain. Eddie listened to the briefing and thought about all the other briefings that had promised quick victories, about all the terrain that had been taken and then abandoned because there simply weren't enough troops to hold everything. But he didn't voice his doubts. He checked his rifle, made sure his grenades were secure, and climbed into the Huey with his squad. The assault on Hill 937 became an exercise in repetitive carnage. The North Vietnamese had dug an elaborate system of bunkers and tunnels into the hillside, reinforced with logs and covered with earth. They'd positioned machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire across the slopes. When the Americans attacked, artillery and airstrikes would pound the hill, turning the summit into a landscape of splintered trees and cratered earth. Then the infantry would advance up the slopes in extended lines, and the North Vietnamese would emerge from their bunkers and cut them down. The Americans would fight to within meters of the summit, only to be pushed back by counterattacks or pinned down by mortar fire. They'd regroup, call in more airstrikes, and do it again. And again. And again. Eddie lost track of the days. Time collapsed into a series of identical moments. The helicopter ride in, the walk through the jungle to the base of the hill, the sound of artillery whistling overhead, the command to advance, the first shots from invisible enemies, the terrible scream of men hit by AK fire or B-40 rockets, the smell of napalm and burning vegetation, the retreat to regroup. His notebook entries became even more sparse. Day 4. Still here. Thompson dead. Day 6, rain. Day 8, made it to top, pushed off. Sanders, Miller, Kowalski, gone. The hill earned its nickname, Hamburger Hill, where men were ground up like meat. After 10 days of fighting, after hundreds of casualties, American forces finally secured Hill 937. They raised the flag, took photographs, filed reports claiming a great victory. The North Vietnamese regiment had withdrawn, leaving behind their dead and empty bunkers. And then, less than a month later, American forces abandoned the hill. There was no strategic value in holding it, they said. It was just one hill among thousands. The North Vietnamese could have it back. Eddie sat on a fire base 30 kilometers away and tried to understand what they had accomplished. His friends had died fighting for a hill that nobody wanted. The newspapers back home were full of outrage. Congress held hearings, and the military brass issued reassurances that this was all part of the larger strategy. But to Eddie, it felt like a betrayal of everyone who'd bled on those slopes. If the hill didn't matter, why had they been ordered to take it? And if it did matter, why were they giving it back? The physical toll of jungle warfare went beyond bullets and shrapnel. Eddie's feet were a disaster. The skin between his toes rotted away from being constantly wet. A condition called immersion foot. Leeches were everywhere, fat black things that attached themselves to any exposed skin and had to be burned off with cigarette tips because pulling them off left their mouthparts embedded, causing infections. Mosquitoes carried malaria and dengue fever. Cuts and scratches became infected almost immediately in the humid environment. Dysentery was so common that most men simply lived with it, shitting their pants during firefights because there was no time to dig a latrine. The average American soldier in Vietnam lost 10 to 15 pounds during a tour, not from lack of food, but from the combination of disease, stress, and the sheer physical demand of humping 70-pound rucks through mountainous jungle in 100-degree heat. For Lon and the other youth volunteers, the physical degradation was even worse. They didn't have medevac helicopters waiting to pull them out if they got hit. Medical care consisted of whatever the unit medic could provide, which was usually just bandages and prayers. She'd seen girls die from infected wounds that would have been trivial to treat with proper antibiotics. She had watched friends waste away from malaria because there was no quinine. One girl in her unit stepped on a dud cluster bomb, and they'd had to bury what was left in a shallow grave by the trail because they couldn't spare the time or energy to carry her body back to a proper cemetery. The official reports listed her as killed in action against American imperialism, but Lon knew the truth. She'd died to a piece of American ordnance that failed to function correctly the first time it was dropped. Just bad luck, and the random cruelty of explosive ordnance. In Washington, the Nixon administration played a complex game. Publicly, they were committed to peace negotiations and Vietnamization. Privately, Kissinger and Nixon believed that one more application of overwhelming force might shock Hanoi into a more favorable settlement. This led to the secret bombing of Cambodia, an operation that was kept from Congress and the American public for months. B-52s flew missions from bases in Thailand and Guam, dropping hundreds of thousands of tons of ordnance on Cambodian territory in an attempt to destroy North Vietnamese supply bases and sanctuaries. The operation was given the cynical codename Menu, with individual missions named after meals: breakfast, lunch, dinner, dessert. Thousands of Cambodian civilians died in these raids, and the secrecy surrounding them would later contribute to Nixon's downfall. The metric that dominated military thinking was the body count. Every operation had to produce numbers. Enemy killed in action. A ratio of their dead to ours, proof that we were winning through attrition. The problem was that body counts were notoriously unreliable. How do you count enemy dead when they drag their casualties away? How do you distinguish between a dead guerrilla fighter and a dead farmer? The pressure to produce impressive numbers led to systematic inflation of kill counts, to civilians being counted as combatants, to an entire statistical apparatus built on lies and wishful thinking. The famous truism emerged: if it's dead and Vietnamese, it's Viet Cong. Generals briefed McNamara and later Kissinger on favorable kill ratios that proved the war was being won, but the war continued with no end in sight. The North Vietnamese had their own forms of statistical manipulation. They did not publicize their casualty figures, and for good reason. The losses were staggering. Entire divisions were decimated in campaigns like Tet and Hamburger Hill, but their strategic calculus was different. They were not trying to win through superior firepower, but through superior endurance. As long as they could keep fielding armies, as long as they could maintain the fight, they believed they would eventually outlast American political will. Hoan, in his bunker, writing his reports, framed every defeat as a strategic victory. We held the enemy for 3 days, we inflicted casualties, we demonstrated revolutionary courage. The actual cost in blood was mentioned only obliquely, if at all. The revolution demanded sacrifice, and who was he to question what the revolution demanded? American war correspondents became increasingly skeptical as the war dragged on. Men like Peter Arnett, David Halberstam, and Neil Sheehan had cut their teeth covering Vietnam in the early 60s, and they'd learned not to trust official briefings. The 5 o'clock follies, they called the daily press conferences in Saigon, where military spokespersons assured reporters that progress was being made, that the enemy was on the ropes, that victory was just around the corner. Then reporters would go into the field and see something completely different. Fire bases under siege, villages destroyed, South Vietnamese officials more interested in corruption than governance, American soldiers smoking marijuana in their bunkers and openly questioning the war's purpose. One particular correspondent embedded with the 101st during the Hamburger Hill operation filmed footage that shocked American audiences. He captured the moment when a medevac helicopter took intense fire trying to extract wounded soldiers from the hillside. The door gunner slumped over his M60. New casualties created while trying to save old ones. He filmed exhausted men with 1,000-yard stares, too tired to react, when artillery rounds impacted nearby. He interviewed a young lieutenant who broke down on camera, crying about the men he'd lost, questioning why they were fighting for a hill that would be abandoned. The footage aired on the evening news, and the Pentagon went ballistic. They accused the correspondent of undermining troop morale, of giving aid and comfort to the enemy. But the correspondent had simply shown the war as it actually was, stripped of the sanitizing language of briefing rooms and policy papers. Back in Eddie's hometown in Pennsylvania, his mother watched the news reports about Hamburger Hill with growing dread. She hadn't heard from Eddie in 3 weeks, which was unusual. Every night she watched Walter Cronkite's sober face deliver the day's casualty count, and every night she prayed that her son wasn't part of that number. The war had split the town down the middle. The VFW post was full of veterans who insisted that America had to stay the course, that pulling out would betray everyone who died so far, that it was a matter of national honor. But at the high school, students were organizing anti-war demonstrations, and when one boy burned his draft card in the town square, it nearly caused a riot. Eddie's mother found herself caught between these positions, wanting to support her son, but increasingly unable to understand what he was dying for. The letters Eddie sent home were carefully censored, not by military censors, but by his own hand. He wrote about the weather, about funny things his buddies said, about looking forward to coming home. He never mentioned the terror of night ambushes, the way Johnson had died screaming for his mother with his intestines in his hands, the casual cruelty that had infected his unit after Hamburger Hill, the way they burned hooches now without checking carefully for civilians first, the way distrust and hatred had replaced whatever idealism he had carried into the war. He wrote cheerful lies because he couldn't bear to burden his mother with the truth, and because putting the truth into words would make it too real, too permanent. By 1970, the anti-war movement had reached critical mass. The Kent State shootings, where National Guard troops fired on student protesters and killed 4 people, galvanized opposition in ways that previous demonstrations hadn't. Veterans joined the protests, throwing their medals over fences at the Capitol, testifying before Congress about atrocities they had witnessed or participated in. The Winter Soldier hearings gave a platform to former soldiers who described free fire zones, the routine torture of prisoners, the indiscriminate use of firepower in populated areas. The military and political establishment tried to dismiss these men as liars and malcontents, but their testimony was too specific, too consistent to be easily discounted. Eddie's unit, rotating through various fire bases after Hamburger Hill, began to show signs of fracture. Some men became increasingly reluctant to patrol, dragging their feet, claiming illness, sometimes simply refusing orders. A few wrote FTA on their helmets, "Fuck the Army," a small act of rebellion in an environment where discipline was supposed to be absolute. There were rumors of officers being fragged, killed by their own men, using fragmentation grenades in situations where the culprit couldn't be identified. Eddie didn't participate in these acts, but he understood them. When a lieutenant with 3 weeks in country orders men who've been in the shit for months to take an exposed patrol route for no clear reason. When the brass seems more interested in body counts than in keeping their own troops alive, the social contract breaks down. Hoan faced similar problems, though they were expressed differently. The North Vietnamese army maintained brutal discipline through political officers and security cadres who watched for signs of defeatism or disloyalty. But even an authoritarian system has limits. Men pushed beyond endurance break in ways that can't be entirely controlled. Hoan noticed the 1,000-yard stares in his unit, the way some soldiers became hollow-eyed and mechanical, following orders but showing no initiative. He wrote reports about maintaining morale, about the need for better supplies and shorter rotations, but these reports went up the chain and disappeared into the bureaucracy. The party line remained unchanged. Sacrifice today for victory tomorrow, no matter how many tomorrows it took. Captain Tran watched American units pulling out of the northern provinces and felt a cold certainty settling into his bones. Vietnamization meant his Marines would be expected to hold positions that had previously required combined U.S.-Vietnamese forces. They would still get air support, theoretically, and artillery backup, but fewer advisors, fewer medevac helicopters, fewer of the logistical miracles that American wealth could provide. He attended briefings where American officers assured their South Vietnamese counterparts that they were ready, that the training had been successful, that the Army of the Republic of Vietnam could stand on its own. Captain Tran nodded and smiled and said the appropriate things, but he'd seen how tenuous their hold on contested areas was, even with full American support. He didn't give voice to his doubts because doubt was disloyalty, and he'd spent too many years fighting to voice disloyalty now. But he began writing letters to his family, just in case, letters to be opened if he didn't come home. In 1971, Eddie Miller rotated back to the United States. His 12-month tour was complete, and he was one of the lucky ones who'd survived intact, at least physically. The flight from Tan Son Nhut to Travis Air Force Base took 20 hours, and Eddie spent most of it staring at the empty seats around him. Seats that would have been filled if Johnson and Miller and Kowalski and all the others had made it. He landed in California in the middle of the night, processed through, and took a bus to the Oakland Army Terminal. In the bathroom, he changed out of his uniform into civilian clothes. An older veteran had advised him to do this, said the airports were full of protesters who spat on soldiers. Eddie didn't want to find out if that was true. His homecoming was not what he'd imagined. There were no parades, no grateful crowds. His father shook his hand and said he was proud, but there was something in his eyes, a sadness or maybe disappointment, that Eddie couldn't quite parse. His mother hugged him and cried and made his favorite dinner, but across the table he could see her stealing glances at him as if he were a stranger. Friends from high school had scattered, some to college, some to Canada to avoid the draft, some dead in Vietnam. The town was divided between those who wanted to pretend the war wasn't happening and those who couldn't stop talking about it. Eddie found that he had nothing to say to either group. The war was an experience that couldn't be translated into language that civilians would understand. It was a secret he shared only with other veterans, and even then, mostly in silence. He tried to go back to his old life, enrolled in community college on the GI Bill, got a job at a hardware store. But he woke up every night at 3 a.m., sweating, heart pounding, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. Loud noises made him flinch. He couldn't focus on his classes because the topics seemed trivial compared to the questions that haunted him. Why had his friends died? What had they accomplished? Why had he survived when better men hadn't? The term for what he was experiencing didn't exist yet in popular consciousness. Post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't be formally recognized until 1980. Eddie just knew that something inside him was broken, and he had no idea how to fix it. Hoan continued fighting through the early 70s, through Lam San 719 and the Easter Offensive of 1972, through more hills and more valleys and more lists of names in his private notebook. The war was approaching its endgame now, the American withdrawal nearly complete, the South Vietnamese fighting desperately with decreasing resources. Hoan had been promoted, given more responsibility, asked to give more speeches about imminent victory. He delivered them mechanically now, the words having lost whatever meaning they once had. At night, in his bunker, he wondered what peace would look like, whether the nightmares would stop, whether there would be any place in the new Vietnam for a man who'd seen too much death. He wondered if he'd even survive to find out. Lan made it through the war, but barely. By 1972, she was 20 years old and looked 40. Her back was permanently damaged from years of carrying heavy loads. She'd contracted falciparum malaria multiple times, and the disease had done lasting damage to her liver. She couldn't have children. a consequence of untreated infections. After reunification, she was given a medal and a small pension, her service officially recognized. But the recognition felt hollow. She'd given her youth, her health, her future to the war. And in return, she got a piece of metal and a monthly stipend that wasn't enough to live on. She never spoke about the war, not to her family, not to anyone. What was there to say? That she'd been patriotic and young and stupid? That the party had used her up and discarded her? That she'd given everything and it still hadn't been enough? Captain Tran died in April 1975 during the final North Vietnamese offensive. His Marine unit fought a desperate rearguard action outside Hue, buying time for civilian refugees to escape. They held for 3 days against overwhelming odds, and then they were overrun. Captain Tran's body was never recovered. His family received no pension, no official recognition, because he'd fought for the losing side. His name appears on no memorials, but the men who served under him remembered. And they passed those stories down, and in that way, he achieved a kind of immortality. The American war in Vietnam ended with helicopters evacuating people from the roof of the embassy in Saigon, with images of desperate Vietnamese clinging to the skids as choppers lifted off, with the understanding that everything America had fought for in Vietnam had come to nothing. 58,000 Americans dead. Hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese dead. Millions of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong dead. Cambodians and Laotians dead, in numbers that would never be accurately counted. And for what? To prove what? That communism could not be contained through military force? That a technologically superior power could still lose to a determined guerrilla army? That no amount of firepower could substitute for political legitimacy? Eddie Miller lived into old age, long enough to see the Vietnam Veterans Memorial built in Washington, long enough to touch the names of his friends carved into the black granite wall. He married, had children, worked ordinary jobs. But a part of him never left the A Shau Valley, never came down from Hamburger Hill. In his final years, suffering from dementia, he would sometimes wake up thinking he was still there, still 19 years old, still preparing for another assault up a hillside that didn't matter. His children didn't understand, but the other old men at the VA hospital did. They shared that secret language of trauma, that bond forged in the valleys where young men had been ground to meat. There are no winners in a war like Vietnam, only varying degrees of loss. The North Vietnamese won in the sense that they achieved their objective of reunification, but at a cost that beggars description. Somewhere between 1 and 3 million dead, an entire generation decimated, an economy shattered, a society traumatized in ways that would take decades to heal. The Americans lost in the conventional sense. They failed to prevent communist victory, withdrew in disgrace, and left behind a legacy of division and doubt that still haunts American foreign policy. The South Vietnamese lost everything: their country, their lives, their futures. And the individuals who fought, regardless of which side they served, lost something ineffable, some piece of themselves that could never be recovered. In the valleys where the meat grinder turned, where Hamburger Hill still rises green and silent, the jungle has reclaimed the battlefield. Trees grow where men once died. Bombs rust in the undergrowth. Occasionally, farmers find bones. The land has healed in ways that people cannot. The scars remain, visible only to those who know where to look, who understand that history is written not just in books, but in the bodies of those who lived through it. The Vietnamese have a saying: "The past is never dead. It's not even past." In the villages along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, in the towns of Pennsylvania and Texas and California where the telegrams arrived, in the streets of Saigon, now called Ho Chi Minh City, the war continues in memory, in trauma, in the questions that have no satisfactory answers. If you could go back and ask them, those young people who marched into the valleys, would they do it again? Eddie would struggle to answer. Hoan would give the party line, but late at night would whisper no. Lan would laugh bitterly and say she had no choice, that poverty and patriotism had conspired to steal her youth. Captain Tran, if he could speak from his unmarked grave, might say that honor and duty compelled him, but he'd wonder if honor was worth the price his family paid. The truth is that they were all caught in forces larger than themselves, ground up by history and ideology and the terrible momentum of war. They did what they thought they had to do, and they paid prices they could never have imagined, and in the end, the only certainty is that the cost was too high, that the valleys took too much, that the meat grinder consumed more than it could ever give back. In wars like these, there are no victors, only survivors and ghosts.